For 43 years, I believed I was building something beautiful. A marriage, a family, a life worth living. I thought the foundation we'd laid together, Michael and I, was solid enough to weather any storm. I thought wrong. The signs had been there for months, maybe even years. But I'd become an expert at explaining them away. The late nights at the office that stretched longer and longer. The way his phone would buzz with messages he'd quickly silence when I walked into the room. The sudden interest in new clothes, a new cologne, a gym membership he'd never bothered with in 2 decades of marriage. "I'm just trying to stay healthy, Sarah," he'd say whenever I mentioned his sudden transformation. "You should be happy I'm taking care of myself." And I was happy. Foolishly, genuinely happy. I thought he was finally prioritizing his well-being after years of letting work consume him. I even encouraged it, bought him new workout clothes, praised him when he came home energized from his evening runs. I was so busy being the supportive wife that I missed what was actually happening. Michael wasn't running toward health. He was running away from us. The evening everything unraveled started like any other. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, his favorite, beef stroganoff, when I heard his key in the lock. But instead of the usual tired sigh and dropping of his briefcase, I heard voices. Plural. "Michael?" I called out, wiping my hands on my apron as I stepped into the hallway. That's when I saw her. She was everything I wasn't, or at least, everything I wasn't anymore. Young, probably early 30s, with that effortless blonde hair that looked like she'd just stepped out of a magazine shoot. Designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And the way she looked at Michael, with an intimacy that made my stomach lurch. "Sarah," Michael said, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in his voice. "This is Jessica. We need to talk." I stood there, still holding the dish towel, feeling like an actress who'd forgotten her lines in the middle of a play. "Need to talk about what?" Jessica shifted beside him, her manicured hand resting possessively on his arm. The diamond on her finger caught the light, a ring I'd never seen before, far more elaborate than the simple band I'd worn for 23 years. "Let's sit down," Michael said, but he didn't move toward our living room. Instead, he stayed planted by the front door, as if he might need to make a quick escape. "I'll stand," I said quietly. Something about the way they were positioned, united, defensive, told me I didn't want to be sitting down for whatever came next. Michael cleared his throat. "Sarah, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this for months. Jessica and we're together. We're engaged." The words hit me like physical blows. "Engaged?" I repeated stupidly. "But we're married. We're still married." "Not for much longer." Jessica spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a slight edge. "The divorce papers were filed last week." I turned to Michael, searching his face for some sign that this was a nightmare I'd wake up from. "Divorce papers?" "Michael, what is she talking about?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. "I had my lawyer handle it. I didn't want to complicate things by involving you in the process unnecessarily." "Unnecessarily?" The word came out as a whisper. "I'm your wife. How is involving me in my own divorce unnecessary?" "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Jessica interjected, stepping slightly forward. "Michael's been trying to spare your feelings, but we need to be practical here. The papers are filed, the house is going on the market next week, and frankly, it's time for you to start thinking about your next steps." I stared at her, then at Michael. "The house is going on the market? This house? Our house?" "Sarah." Michael's voice carried that tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Be realistic. This house is way too big for just one person. You can't afford to maintain it on your part-time salary from the bookstore. We need to sell it and split the proceeds." "Split the proceeds," I repeated numbly. "And then what? Where am I supposed to go?" Jessica and Michael exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. It was the look of two people who'd already discussed. This who'd already made plans that didn't include considering my feelings or my future. "That's what we wanted to talk to you about," Michael said. "Jessica's been doing some research, and there are some really nice assisted living communities in the area. Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or cooking or assisted living?" The words exploded out of me. "I'm 46 years old, Michael. Assisted living is for elderly people who can't take care of themselves." "Well, Jessica," said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, "that's not entirely inaccurate, is it?" Michael shot her a warning look, but she continued, emboldened by his lack of real protest. "I mean, let's be honest here, Sarah. When was the last time you contributed something meaningful to this household? You work part-time at a bookstore, making what, minimum wage? You don't have any real skills, any education beyond high school. Michael's been carrying you financially for over 2 decades. The room started to spin around me. Carrying me? I raised our children. I managed this household. I supported Michael's career by handling everything else so he could focus on work." "Our children?" Jessica's eyebrows rose. "I think you mean your children. Michael has been very clear with me about the burden that whole situation has been for him." The word burden hit me like a slap. I turned to Michael, waiting for him to correct her, to defend me, to show some trace of the man I'd married. Instead, he looked away. "Michael," I said quietly, "tell her that's not true. Tell her about how we planned for Emma and David. Tell her about how happy you were when they were born. Tell her—" "Sarah, stop." His voice was tired, defeated. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You live in this fantasy world where everything was perfect, but it wasn't. I never wanted kids that young. I wasn't ready for the responsibility, the financial pressure. And now that they're adults, I finally have a chance to live my life the way I want to." The betrayal in those words was so complete, so devastating that I had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. Our children, Emma, 22 and just graduated from college, and David, 25 and working as a teacher, had been the center of our world. Or at least, I'd thought they were. "They're your children too," I whispered. "Biologically, yes," Michael said. "But let's be honest, Sarah. You made all the parenting decisions. You wanted them more than I did. And now I'm paying for college, loans, and helping with their expenses while trying to start fresh with Jessica. It's been a burden." There was that word again. Burden. Jessica smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that told me she'd been coaching him on this speech. "The point is, Michael deserves to be happy. And frankly, so do you. This assisted living place we looked at has activities, meal plans, other women your age to socialize with. It would be perfect for someone in your situation." "My situation," I repeated slowly. "And what situation is that exactly?" "Well," Jessica gestured vaguely at me, "you're middle-aged, unemployed for all practical purposes, with no real prospects. You're basically dependent on Michael for everything. At least in assisted living, you'd have some structure, some purpose." Looked at my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, standing there in our foyer, letting this woman, this stranger, tear apart my entire life while he nodded along like it all made perfect sense. "Get out," I said quietly. "Sarah," Michael started. "Get out!" The words erupted from somewhere deep inside me, a place I didn't even know existed. "Both of you, get out of my house right now." "Actually," Jessica said smugly, "it's not your house anymore. The divorce papers clearly state—" "I don't care what the papers say. Until I sign them, until a judge signs them, this is still my home, and I want you out of it. Now." Michael looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my face must have warned him off. "We'll give you some time to process this," he said. "But Sarah, you need to be reasonable. The house goes on the market Monday whether you agree or not." They turned to leave, Jessica's heels clicking triumphantly on the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago. At the door, Michael paused. "For what it's worth," he said without looking at me. "I never meant for it to happen this way. But I can't keep pretending to be happy in a life that doesn't fit me anymore." The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly cavernous house. I stood there for a long time, still holding that dish towel, still smelling the beef stroganoff burning on the stove. Then I walked into the kitchen, turned off the burner, and sat down at the table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together. Where I'd helped Emma with her homework and listened to David practice his presentations. Where Michael and I had planned our future, dreamed about our retirement, talked about growing old together. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and seemingly endless. But underneath the grief, underneath the shock and betrayal, something else was stirring. Something harder and more dangerous. If Michael wanted to call me a burden, if he thought I was some helpless, dependent woman who would just roll over and accept whatever crumbs he and his new wife decided to throw my way, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Diana Marsh had been my college roommate before I'd dropped out to marry Michael. She'd gone on to become one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state. "Diana?" I said when she answered. "It's Sarah Connor. I know it's been years, but I need help. I need the best lawyer you know, and I need them tomorrow." After I hung up, I went to Michael's home office and began taking pictures. Every document, every file, every piece of paper that might be relevant to our finances. If he thought he could ambush me with divorce papers and walk away with everything while shipping me off to assisted living, he had seriously underestimated the woman he'd spent 23 years dismissing. I worked through the night, documenting everything. Bank statements, investment accounts, the deed to the house, his retirement funds, insurance policies. By the time the sun came up, I had a complete picture of our financial life. And I was shocked by what I found. Michael had been moving money. Significant amounts of money. Transferring funds to accounts I'd never seen before. Accounts that were probably in Jessica's name or hidden in some offshore arrangement. He'd been planning this for months, maybe even years, systematically stripping our joint assets while I trusted him completely. But Michael had made one crucial mistake. In his eagerness to hide money from me, he'd forgotten about the inheritance. My grandmother had died 3 years ago, leaving me a substantial sum that I'd invested separately, keeping it as a surprise nest egg for our retirement. Michael knew about the inheritance, but he'd never paid attention to how much it was or where I'd put it. In his mind, it was probably just some small amount that wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. He was wrong. Between the smart investments my financial advisor had recommended and the recent surge in the tech stocks I'd chosen, my grandmother's $150,000 gift had grown to over $800,000. Money that was mine alone, that had never been in our joint accounts, that Michael couldn't touch. Suddenly, assisted living didn't seem like my only option. I made another phone call. This one to Emma. "Mom." She sounded sleepy. I'd forgotten it was still early. "Is everything okay?" "Sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to tell you something about your father and me." The conversation was heartbreaking. Emma cried, David shouted, and both of them demanded to know how Michael could do this to us, to our family. But by the end of both calls, I knew I had their support. More than that, I had their anger on my behalf. "Mom," David said, "whatever you need, we're here. Dad can go to hell." "Don't say that about your father," I said automatically, then stopped myself. "Actually, you know what? Say whatever you want about your father. He's made his choices." That afternoon, I met with Diana's colleague, James Patterson, arguably the most aggressive divorce attorney in the city. When I showed him the evidence of Michael's financial maneuvering, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Mrs. Connor," he said, Your husband has committed several serious legal violations: asset hiding, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Not only can we stop the sale of your house, we can make sure he pays dearly for what he's tried to do. I don't want to just stop him, I said. I want to make sure he understands exactly what kind of burden he's created for himself. James smiled. I think we can arrange that. The first shot across the bow came Monday morning. Instead of the house going on the market as planned, Michael received a court injunction freezing all our assets pending a full financial investigation. The second shot came Tuesday, when Jessica discovered that the credit cards Michael had been using to fund their relationship, cards that were linked to our joint accounts, had been suspended. By Wednesday, Michael was calling me nonstop. Sarah, what the hell is going on? I can't access any of our accounts. The realtor says there's some kind of legal hold on the house. What did you do? I hired a lawyer, I said calmly. A very good lawyer. Turns out there are laws about hiding assets during divorce proceedings. Who knew? I didn't hide anything, he sputtered. You just what, Michael? Transferred $200,000 to an account in Jessica's name? Took out a second mortgage on our house without telling me? Moved your retirement funds to some mysterious offshore investment that doesn't seem to exist? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Sarah, he said finally, we can work this out. We don't need to involve lawyers and courts. We're both reasonable people. No, Michael, you're not a reasonable person. A reasonable person doesn't ambush his wife with divorce papers served by his girlfriend. A reasonable person doesn't try to steal $500,000 and ship his ex-wife off to assisted living. But don't worry, I'm going to help you understand exactly what reasonable looks like. Over the next few weeks, as James worked his legal magic, I made my own preparations. The first thing I did was buy a new house. Not just any house, a gorgeous Victorian mansion in the historic district, the kind of place Michael and I had always admired but never thought we could afford. It turned out I could afford it quite easily with my inheritance and the equity I was entitled to from our current house. The Victorian needed work, but it had good bones and unlimited potential. More importantly, it was mine. Only mine. The second thing I did was quit my part-time job at the bookstore and start my own business. I'd always been good with numbers, good with organizing, good with managing complex projects. I just hadn't thought of those skills as marketable because Michael had never valued them, but plenty of other people did. I started a concierge service for busy professionals, managing their schedules, organizing their homes, handling their personal affairs. Within a month, I had 6 clients. Within 2 months, I had 12. Turns out, being a burden had actually trained me to be incredibly competent at managing multiple complex responsibilities. The third thing I did was join the country club where Michael had always wanted to be a member, but couldn't afford the initiation fee. With my new income and my inheritance, I could afford it easily. I also joined the board of the local historical society, started taking art classes, and enrolled in a master's program in business administration. In short, I began living the life I'd always wanted but had never thought I deserved. Michael, meanwhile, was discovering what it actually cost to maintain his new lifestyle. Jessica's tastes were expensive, and without access to our hidden assets, he was struggling. The court had frozen his ability to transfer any more money, and James was systematically uncovering every dollar he'd tried to hide. It was Emma who told me about the first crack in their relationship. "Dad called me crying," she said during one of our weekly dinners. "Can you believe that? He was actually crying because Jessica is mad that he can't take her to Paris for her birthday. She told him he was not the man she thought he was, and that maybe they should reconsider the engagement." "I see," I said, cutting into my perfectly prepared salmon. We were eating at the country club, where I'd become something of a fixture. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that actions have consequences, and maybe he should have thought about what kind of man he wanted to be before he decided to blow up his family. I smiled. Emma had inherited her grandfather's backbone along with his eyes. Mom, she continued, I have to ask, are you happy? Really happy? Because you seem different, stronger. I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? 6 months ago, if someone had told me my marriage would end, that I'd be living alone, that I'd be starting over at 46, I would have thought it was the worst thing that could possibly happen. Instead, it was turning out to be the best thing that had ever happened to me. You know what, sweetheart? I said. I think I am happy. For the first time in a very long time, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. But happiness, I was learning, was only the beginning. Michael had called me a burden, had tried to discard me like an unwanted piece of furniture. Now it was time to show him what a real burden looked like. The next phase of my plan was about to begin, and Michael had no idea what was coming for him. 3 months into my new life, I received an unexpected phone call that would set everything else in motion. Mrs. Connor, this is Rebecca Walsh from Walsh & Associates. I represent Jessica Morrison in a rather delicate matter. I was sitting in my home office in the Victorian mansion, reviewing client files for my rapidly expanding concierge business. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that still made me smile every time I noticed it. I see, I said carefully. And what matter would that be? Ms. Morrison is concerned about some irregularities in her relationship with your ex-husband. She's discovered that Mr. Connor may not have been entirely truthful about his financial situation, and she's seeking legal advice about protecting her own interests. I set down my coffee cup slowly. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure why this concerns me. Michael and I are in the middle of divorce proceedings, but his relationship with Ms. Morrison is entirely separate from that. Well, that's where things get complicated, Rebecca continued. Ms. Morrison has discovered that the engagement ring Mr. Connor gave her was purchased with funds that may have been inappropriately acquired. She's worried about potential legal liability. I couldn't help the small smile that crossed my face. Inappropriately acquired, how? Credit card fraud, essentially. The card was in your name, Mrs. Connor. Ms. Morrison had no idea, of course, but when the bills started coming due and Mr. Connor couldn't pay them, she did some investigating of her own. The smile widened. Michael had used our joint credit card, the one I'd had suspended, to buy Jessica's engagement ring. A ring that probably cost more than some people's cars, knowing Jessica's taste. When the bill came due and he couldn't pay it, Jessica had discovered the truth about his financial situation. I see, I said. And what does Ms. Morrison want from me? She'd like to meet with you, privately. She has some information she thinks you might find useful in your divorce proceedings. In exchange, she's hoping you might be willing to provide a character reference that she had no knowledge of. Mr. Connor's fraudulent activities. This was interesting. Very interesting. When did you have in mind? I asked. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. I arrived early and positioned myself at a corner table where I could see the entire room. When Jessica walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the perfectly polished woman who'd stood in my foyer 3 months ago, radiating confidence and superiority. This Jessica looked tired, stressed, and significantly less put together. Her designer clothes were still expensive, but they hung on her differently, like she'd lost weight from stress. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I could see the faint lines of worry around her eyes. She spotted me and walked over hesitantly, her previous arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Sarah, she said quietly, sliding into the chair across from me. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I have to admit, I'm curious, I said, keeping my voice neutral. 6 months ago, you were telling me about assisted living facilities. Now you want to chat over coffee? Jessica flinched. I deserved that. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I'm listening. She took a shaky breath. When Michael and I started, whatever this was, he painted a very specific picture of your marriage. He told me you were clinically depressed, that you'd become completely dependent on him, that you refused to work or contribute to the household. He made it sound like you were this pathetic woman who was dragging him down. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him, she admitted. It made it easier to justify what we were doing. If you were this terrible burden on his life, then I was actually helping him by giving him a way out. I sipped my coffee and waited. This was her show. But then I started living with him, Jessica continued. And I realized that everything he'd told me about you applied to him. He expected me to manage his entire life, his schedule, his meals, his laundry, his social obligations. He wanted me to be his personal assistant and his arm candy and his emotional support system all rolled into one. Welcome to my world, I said dryly. It gets worse. When the credit cards got suspended and he couldn't access your joint accounts anymore, he started asking me to pay for everything. Dinners, his car payment, his gym membership. He said it was temporary, just until the divorce was finalized and he got his share of the assets. But the divorce wasn't going the way he expected. No. Your lawyer is apparently very good. Michael started getting more and more stressed about money, more demanding, more... She paused, choosing her words carefully. More abusive. That got my attention. Abusive how? Never physical, she said quickly. But verbally, emotionally. When I couldn't or wouldn't pay for something he wanted, he'd explode. Tell me I was selfish, that I didn't understand what he was going through, that I was supposed to support him the way a real partner would. I felt a chill of recognition. The way a real partner would. Yes. And then he started comparing me to you, telling me that at least you had understood your role in the relationship, that you had never questioned his decisions or made him explain himself. He was rewriting history, I said, making me sound like the perfect wife now that he didn't have me anymore? Exactly. And when I pointed out that he'd spent months telling me how awful you were, he said I was being dramatic and that I was starting to sound just like you. Jessica's voice cracked slightly. That's when I knew I'd made a huge mistake. So you hired a lawyer. I hired a lawyer and started doing my own research. Sarah, I had no idea about your business, your house, your whole new life. Michael told me you were living in some tiny apartment, barely getting by. When I drove past your house, you've been to my house? She had the grace to look embarrassed. I was curious. I wanted to see how you were really doing. And that beautiful Victorian mansion, I realized that everything Michael had told me was a lie. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. So what do you want from me, Jessica? I want out, she said simply. But I'm scared. Michael has been talking about what he's going to do when the divorce is final, how he's going to make you pay for destroying his life. He's angry, Sarah. Really angry. And some of the things he's said... What kind of things? He's been researching. You. Your business. Your clients. Your new social connections. He found out about your membership at the country club and he was furious. He said you were living off money that should have been his, and that he was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person you really were. A cold anger settled in my chest. What kind of person I really was? He's planning something. I don't know what exactly, but he's been making phone calls, meeting with people. And Jessica? She stopped, looking genuinely frightened. He's been asking questions about your children, Emma and David. He wants to know where they work, where they live, who they're dating. The temperature in the coffee shop seemed to drop. 20 degrees. He what? I think he's planning to go after them somehow. Make their lives difficult as a way to get to you. Jessica leaned forward urgently. Sarah, I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what I did, but you need to be careful. And your kids need to be careful too. I sat there for a long moment, processing this information. Michael was escalating. The legal pressure from the divorce, the financial stress, the reality of what his life looked like without me to manage. It was all adding up to something dangerous. "What information do you have for me?" I asked. Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Copies of everything. Bank statements showing where he moved the money, emails between him and his financial advisor about hiding assets, text messages where he talks about his plans for after the divorce, and recordings. Recordings? I started recording our conversations when things got bad, for my own protection. Some of them are pretty damning. I took the folder, feeling its weight. And in exchange, I want to disappear before this gets worse. If you could provide a statement that I had no knowledge of the credit card fraud, that I cooperated with your investigation, it would help me get clear of this mess without any legal consequences. Done, I said immediately. But Jessica, I need you to do something else for me. Name it. I need you to stay in contact with Michael for a little while longer, just long enough for me to prepare for whatever he's planning. Can you do that? She nodded, though she looked terrified. How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. I promise I'll make sure you're protected, but I need to know what he's up to. We shook hands across the table. 2 women who had been enemies forming an unlikely alliance against the man who had betrayed us both. That evening, I called Emma and David and asked them to come over for dinner. When they arrived and saw the serious expression on my face, they immediately knew something was wrong. "Kids," I said, "we need to talk about your father." I told them everything Jessica had shared, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, determination. "So he's coming after us now?" David asked, his jaw tight. "Because he can't get to you directly?" "It looks that way." Emma was pacing around my kitchen, her face flushed with fury. "I can't believe him. I can't believe this is the same man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my science projects." "People change," I said gently, "or maybe they just show us who they really were all along." "So what do we do?" David asked. I smiled, and both my children looked a little alarmed by the expression on my face. "We get ahead of him," I said. "Your father wants to play games? Fine. Let's play." Over the next few days, I put several plans into motion. First, I hired a private investigator to document Michael's activities and create a timeline of his behavior since the separation. Second, I met with James Patterson to share Jessica's information and develop a legal strategy for protecting my children. Third, I made some calls to my new social network. One of the advantages of joining the country club and the historical society was that I'd met some very influential people. People who didn't like bullies and who had the power to make life difficult for anyone who crossed them. It turned out that Michael's behavior toward me hadn't gone unnoticed in our social circle. Several people had heard about the way he'd handled our separation, and they weren't impressed. When I discreetly mentioned that he was now targeting our children, the response was swift and protective. Within a week, Michael discovered that his reputation in the business community had taken a serious hit. Contracts that should have been routine started falling through. Business lunches were canceled. Networking events that had always welcomed him suddenly had no room on their guest lists. But the real blow came when he tried to implement his plan against Emma. Emma worked for a prestigious marketing firm downtown, a company that happened to be owned by Richard Blackwood, one of my new acquaintances from the country club. Michael's plan, as best we could determine, was to contact Emma's employer with some fabricated story about her being unreliable or unprofessional, hoping to damage her career prospects. Instead, when Michael called Richard's office and tried to schedule a meeting to discuss concerns about Emma Connor's character, Richard's assistant politely took a message and then immediately called me. "Sarah, Richard said when he called me that evening. "I think you should know that your ex-husband just tried to torpedo your daughter's career. My assistant recorded the entire conversation." "What did he say?" "He claimed Emma had been stealing from your family for years, that she was emotionally unstable, and that I should be aware of her criminal tendencies before she cost my company money." I felt sick. "Richard, I'm so sorry. Emma would never—" "Sarah, stop. I've worked with Emma for 2 years. She's one of the most honest, capable people I've ever employed. Your ex-husband just made a very serious mistake." "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm filing a defamation lawsuit against him tomorrow morning. And I'm making sure every business owner in this city knows what kind of man he really is." The next few days were a whirlwind of consequences for Michael. The defamation lawsuit was just the beginning. Word spread quickly through the business community about what he'd tried to do to Emma, and the reaction was swift and merciless. Michael's own employer, a mid-sized accounting firm, received several calls from major clients expressing concerns about the character of their employees. Within a week, Michael was called into a meeting with the senior partners and given a choice: resign quietly or be terminated for conduct detrimental to the firm's reputation. He chose to resign, but by then, his reputation in the local accounting community was finished. No reputable firm would touch him. Jessica called me the day after Michael lost his job. "He's completely lost it," she said, her voice shaking. "He's been drinking, ranting about how you've destroyed his life, how he's going to make you pay." "Sarah, I'm scared. I think he might do something really stupid." "Where are you now?" "I moved out. I'm staying with a friend, but he keeps calling, keeps showing up at my work. I don't think I can keep pretending much longer." "You don't have to," I said. "It's time for the final move." That evening, I made a call to Detective Martinez, a contact I'd made through my private investigator. "Detective, I need to report harassment and potential stalking. I have documentation of threatening behavior and evidence of ongoing harassment toward myself and my children. How soon can you come in?" "I'm on my way." The police took my report seriously, especially when I presented them with Jessica's recordings, the private investigator's documentation, and Richard Blackwood's statement about the attempted defamation of Emma. A restraining order was issued that night. Michael was served with the papers the next morning at his apartment, the small, shabby place he'd moved to after Jessica threw him out. According to the process server, he broke down completely when he realized what the papers meant. He was legally prohibited from contacting me, Emma, David, or Jessica. He couldn't come within 500 feet of our homes or workplaces, and any violation would result in immediate arrest. But more than that, he was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what he'd lost. His marriage, his home, his fiancée, his job, his reputation, his relationship with his children, all of it was gone. And it was gone because he'd convinced himself that I was the burden in his life. As I sat in my beautiful Victorian mansion that evening, reviewing the client files for my thriving business and planning my weekend activities at the country club, I couldn't help but think about irony. Michael had called me a burden and tried to ship me off to assisted living. Now he was the one who was unemployed, homeless for all practical purposes, and completely dependent on others for his survival. But this was only the beginning. Michael had spent months planning my destruction, and now it was my turn to show him what real planning looked like. The next phase of my plan would ensure that he never forgot the cost of calling me a burden. The restraining order was just the legal framework. What happened next was pure social warfare, and I discovered I had a talent for it that surprised even me. It started with a phone call from Margaret Whitfield, the president of the Historical Society and wife of the city's most prominent judge. I was in my garden, pruning the roses that had come with the Victorian mansion, when my phone rang. "Sarah, dear." Margaret's cultured voice carried a hint of steel that I'd learned to recognize. "I've been hearing some disturbing stories about—" Your ex-husband's behavior. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about how the community should respond to such unseemly conduct. Within an hour, I was sitting in Margaret's impeccably appointed living room, being served tea from China that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent. But this wasn't a social call. The thing about men like your Michael, Margaret said, settling into her chair with the authority of someone who'd been managing social dynamics for 60 years, is that they believe they can reinvent themselves simply by changing wives. They think no one will notice their character flaws if they present a prettier package. And do they usually succeed? Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Not in my town, they don't. What I learned over the next hour was that Margaret and her circle had been watching Michael's behavior long before our divorce. His treatment of me during our marriage, his sudden transformation, his public flaunting of Jessica, none of it had gone unnoticed by the women who actually ran the social and business networks in our city. We've been waiting, Margaret explained, for you to find your footing. We don't rescue women, dear. We empower them to rescue themselves. And you've done that beautifully. What happens now? Now we make sure Michael understands that actions have consequences. Real consequences. The first consequence came in the form of his lease. Michael's apartment was in a building owned by Whitfield Properties, one of Judge Whitfield's many business interests. When the lease came up for renewal, it was quietly denied. No explanation given, just a simple notice that his tenancy would not be continued. The second consequence was his car loan. The bank that held the note was headed by Thomas Richardson, whose wife Claire was my instructor in the watercolor painting class I'd joined. When Michael missed a payment, which he inevitably did, having no income, the bank declined to work out a payment plan. The car was repossessed within a week, but the real genius of Margaret's network was how invisible it all seemed. To anyone looking from the outside, Michael was simply a man whose luck had run out. A series of unfortunate but perfectly legal business decisions that had nothing to do with his personal conduct, except it had everything to do with his personal conduct. The thing is, Claire Richardson explained to me during our painting session, men like Michael think they're entitled to success without character. They believe they can treat people badly and still expect those same people to do business with them. It's quite naive, really. I was learning to see the world differently. For 23 years, I'd believed that being a good wife meant being invisible, supportive, undemanding. I'd thought that was virtue. But these women, successful, powerful, connected women, had shown me that there was another way to be good. Being good could mean having standards. It could mean holding people accountable. It could mean using your influence to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. It was intoxicating. The third week after the restraining order, I received a call from David. "Mom, you need to see this," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. He arrived at my house 20 minutes later with his laptop, practically vibrating with energy. "I've been keeping tabs on Dad's social media," he said, setting up his computer on my kitchen table. "You know how he's been posting all these self-pity updates about how his life fell apart through no fault of his own?" I nodded. I'd heard about Michael's digital pity party from Emma, though I hadn't looked at it myself. "Well, look at this," David said, clicking through to Michael's Facebook page. What I saw made my jaw drop. In the past month, Michael had posted dozens of updates chronicling his descent into victimhood, posts about being betrayed by the people he trusted most, complaints about vindictive ex-wives who use the legal system as a weapon, rants about how successful men are targeted by jealous women who can't handle being left behind. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the comments. Every single post had been screenshot and shared in various community groups, local business networks, neighborhood associations, church groups, alumni pages. David had tracked the spread of Michael's posts across social media, and the response was universally negative. "He's made himself the poster child for midlife crisis disasters," David said, scrolling through comment after comment calling Michael pathetic, selfish, and embarrassing. "And the best part? He has no idea. He thinks people are just not seeing his posts, so he keeps making them more and more dramatic." The most recent post was a doozy. Michael had written a long screed about how certain people were conspiring to destroy his life, how his ex-wife had poisoned the community against him, and how he was considering legal action against the network of bitter women who can't stand to see a man move on with his life. The responses were swift and brutal. "This is what happens when you cheat on your wife and try to throw her in a nursing home," wrote someone I recognized as the wife of Michael's former golf partner. "Maybe. If you hadn't tried to destroy your daughter's career, people would have more sympathy," posted another. "The certain people he's talking about are anyone with basic human decency," added a third. But the comment that made me laugh out loud came from Jessica herself. "For the record, I left him because he expected me to be his mommy, not because of any conspiracy. Some men are just exhausting." "Mom," David said, "he's destroying himself faster than we ever could. Every post makes him look worse and he can't seem to stop." That evening, I had dinner with Emma at the country club. We were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the golf course in shades of gold and pink, when she brought up something that had been bothering her. "Mom, I keep thinking about what Jessica said, about Dad asking questions about where David and I live, who we're dating. It makes me wonder, how long has he been like this?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, was he always this controlling, this vindictive, and we just didn't see it? Or did losing you somehow turn him into this person?" I considered the question carefully. It was something I'd been wondering about myself. "I think," I said slowly, "that your father always had these tendencies. But when we were married, I managed them for him. I smoothed over his mistakes, made excuses for his behavior, handled all the social and emotional labor that kept his worst impulses in check." "So you were protecting the world from him?" "In a way, yes. And I was protecting him from the consequences of his own choices." Emma was quiet for a moment, sipping her wine and watching a foursome finish up on the 18th hole. "Do you think he understands that yet?" she asked. "No," I said. "But he will." The opportunity to drive that lesson home came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, Margaret Whitfield called with information that changed everything. "Sarah, dear, I've just learned something very interesting about your Michael. He's been telling people that he's planning to move to Florida, start fresh somewhere no one knows his history. And he's applied for several jobs down there. Accounting positions with firms that do business with companies up here. Companies owned by people I know." I felt a familiar chill of anticipation. "What kind of companies?" "The kind that value character and integrity above all else. The kind that would be very interested to know about an applicant's history of fraud, asset hiding, and harassment." "Margaret, you've been busy." "Oh, my dear, I'm just getting started. You see, Michael made one crucial error in his escape planning." "Which was?" "He assumed that his reputation wouldn't follow him. He thought geography would solve his character problem. But in today's connected world, reputation is portable. And I have friends in very high places in Florida." What happened? Next was a masterclass in network effects. Within 48 hours, every accounting firm Michael had applied to received calls from existing clients expressing concerns about their hiring practices. Not direct accusations, nothing that could be traced back to any individual, just gentle suggestions that they might want to do more thorough background checks on potential employees. The first job offer was rescinded on Tuesday, the second on Wednesday. By Friday, Michael's Florida escape plan had completely collapsed, but the real stroke of genius came from an unexpected source: Jessica. She called me that weekend, her voice carrying a mix of nervousness and determination. "Sarah, I've been thinking. About what you said. About staying in contact with Michael for a little while. I have an idea, but I need your help to pull it off. I'm listening. Michael's been begging me to take him back. He's desperate, financially and emotionally. What if I pretended to consider it? Just long enough to get him to admit some things on record? The plan Jessica proposed was brilliant in its simplicity. She would meet with Michael, ostensibly, to discuss reconciliation, but actually to get him to confess to the various fraudulent and vindictive things he'd done. She'd record everything, providing the final piece of evidence needed to ensure he faced real legal consequences for his actions. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. "It could be dangerous if he realizes what you're doing." "Sarah, this man destroyed my life too. He convinced me to leave my job, abandon my friends, alienate my family, all for a relationship based on lies. I want him to face consequences for what he's done to both of us." We arranged the meeting for the following Tuesday at a restaurant downtown. Jessica would wear a wire provided by my lawyer's private investigator, and there would be backup nearby in case things went wrong. The morning of the meeting, I was surprisingly nervous. This felt like the culmination of everything that had been, building since that awful night when Michael and Jessica had first shown up at my door. Jessica called me at 2 p.m. "It's done," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Sarah, it was even worse than we thought." "What did he say?" "Everything. He admitted to hiding the money, to trying to sabotage Emma's career, to planning to make your life hell until you agreed to give him what he wanted. But the worst part was why he did it." "Why?" "He said he'd spent 23 years being married to someone who made him feel small and inadequate. He said that every time you succeeded at something, managing the household, handling a crisis, even just being competent, it reminded him of his own failures. So when he found me, someone who looked up to him and made him feel powerful, he decided he deserved that feeling more than he deserved to honor his commitments to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. After all these months, after everything that had happened, this was the truth. Michael hadn't left me because I was a burden. He'd left me because I wasn't enough of a burden. I'd been too competent, too independent, too capable of managing my own life. "Sarah? Are you there?" "I'm here," I said quietly. "Jessica, thank you for everything. What happens now? Now we finish this." The recording Jessica had made was the final piece of evidence James Patterson needed to file criminal charges for fraud and harassment. But more than that, it was the key to something I'd been planning for weeks. That evening, I made a phone call to the local news station. The investigative reporter who answered was someone I'd met through the Historical Society, another connection in the network that had become my greatest weapon. "Lisa, it's Sarah Connor. I have a story I think you might be interested in about financial fraud, domestic abuse, and how one man's midlife crisis became a cautionary tale about the consequences of treating people like disposable objects." "I'm listening." "What would you say to an exclusive interview with the ex-wife of a local man who tried to defraud her of hundreds of thousands of dollars, then attempted to destroy their children's careers when his plan failed? Complete with documented evidence and recorded confessions?" There was a pause. "When can we meet?" By the time the interview aired the following week, Michael's story had become a local sensation. But it wasn't the story he would have wanted to tell. Instead of the narrative of a successful man brought low by a vindictive ex-wife, the community saw the truth. A man who had systematically abused the trust and love of his family, committed fraud to fund his affair, and then tried to destroy the lives of innocent people when he faced consequences for his actions. The night the story aired, Emma and David came over to watch it with me. As we sat in my living room, seeing our family's story told truthfully for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. "Mom," Emma said during a commercial break, Are you okay? Seeing all of this on TV? It can't be easy. I looked around my beautiful home, thought about my thriving business, my new friendships, my children's love and respect, and my hard-won independence. You know what, sweetheart? I said. I think I'm better than okay. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Michael's public humiliation was complete, but there were still consequences he hadn't faced, still lessons he hadn't learned. The final act was about to begin. The news story changed everything overnight. My phone exploded with calls from old friends, distant relatives, and complete strangers offering support. But the call that surprised me most came from Michael's own mother. "Sarah, dear." Eleanor's voice shook with emotion. "I just watched that news story. I owe you the biggest apology. I raised that man, and I'm mortified by what he's become." Even his family had turned against him. Within days, the consequences multiplied. The district attorney pressed criminal charges for fraud. 3 law firms called wanting to hire me as a consultant for complex divorce cases. A family therapist asked me to speak at support groups for women going through similar situations. Michael's world collapsed completely. His brother told Emma the whole family had cut contact with him. His former colleagues refused his calls. He'd become unemployable, friendless, and utterly alone. 3 weeks later, I was gardening when a taxi pulled into my driveway. My blood ran cold when Michael stepped out, looking haggard and desperate. "Sarah," he called, his voice hoarse. "Please, I need to talk to you." I reached for my phone. "You're violating the restraining order. Please." He dropped to his knees in my driveway, tears streaming down his face. "Just 5 minutes. I can't live like this anymore." "What do you want, Michael?" "I want to understand how this happened. How I went from having everything to having nothing." "How you went from being—" He choked on the words. "From being what?" "Say it." "From being the woman I thought was holding me back to being the most successful person in this city." I stepped to the edge of my porch, maintaining distance but close enough for him to hear clearly. "For 23 years, Michael, I made you look good. I managed your life, covered your mistakes, and made excuses for your behavior. When you left me, you didn't just lose a wife. You lost the entire invisible infrastructure holding your life together." He listened, sobbing. "You called me a burden because it was easier than admitting the truth, that you were the burden. You couldn't manage basic adult responsibilities. You needed constant emotional maintenance. You were so insecure you had to tear down the person who loved you most. What can I do? How can I fix this?" "You can't fix this, Michael. This is who you've always been. The only difference is now everyone can see it." I turned toward my house, then paused. "The next time you want to call someone a burden, look in the mirror first." I called the police immediately. Michael was arrested for violating the restraining order, his 3rd arrest in 2 months. 6 months later, Michael had pleaded guilty and was serving jail time. Meanwhile, I'd launched Second Act Consulting, helping women navigate divorce and rebuild their lives. I became a regular speaker at support groups, sharing my story with women who needed to hear that starting over was possible. 1 year after that terrible night when Michael brought Jessica to my door, I was featured on the cover of the city's business magazine as Entrepreneur of the Year. On my divorce anniversary, I threw a party, not celebrating Michael's destruction, but my rebirth. My Victorian mansion filled with real friends who valued me for who I actually was. Margaret Whitfield raised a toast to Sarah, who taught us that the greatest burden any woman can carry is a man who doesn't deserve her, and the greatest gift she can give herself is learning to put that burden down. As I looked around my beautiful home, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, I thought about that night when Michael called me a burden. He'd been right about one thing. I had been carrying a burden, but it hadn't been me. It had been him. And now, finally, I was free.